record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee, and our witnesses for participating in today's hearing. Today, we will examine private funding and the influence it's had on the administration of our nation's elections. Secure elections require proper election administration. Americans deserve to have confidence in their elections, which means elections should be free from undue private influence. In recent years, we've seen millions of dollars in private money flow unchecked to states and local government elections offices. Unlike political contribution, these funds are unregulated in many ways. Zuckerbucks, a shorthand term for the private funding provided to states and localities, beginning with the 2020 election, has sowed distrust in our elections. In the fall of 2020, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, contributed $350 million in tax-exempt funds to the Center for Tech and Civic Life. The couple also gave $70 million to the Center for Election Innovation and Research. In turn, these groups sent multi-million-dollar checks to states and localities for their election administration efforts. Publicly, CTCL said these funds were intended to support poll worker recruitment efforts or the purchase of new equipment. But in reality, some of these funds were used primarily for voter registration events and get-out-the-vote efforts in Democratic-leaning cities and towns. In my home state of Wisconsin, Zuckerbucks has sowed distrust in our elections. Let's take one example. In southeast Wisconsin, in the city of Racine, a mobile voting van traveled around the city of Racine, a historically Democratic city, to meet voters and collect early ballots. Racine election administrators used Zuckerbucks to buy what looks like a food truck, labeled it the clerk's office, then drove it around and collected ballots in highly propensity Democratic areas. Wisconsin citizens complained that the city's use of the van was illegal under Wisconsin law, risked opportunities for voter fraud, and was used to advantage Democrats. Now, just last month, a Wisconsin judge ruled the practice was illegal. Wisconsin voters are concerned about undue private influence in the administration of our nation's elections. Elections are partisan, but elections administration should never be partisan. The millions of private dollars being funneled to local offices raises serious questions about the conditions placed on their use. Imagine this Sunday night at the Super Bowl if the refs were paid for by a tech billionaire from San Francisco. How do you think Taylor Swift and Kansas City Chief fans would feel about that? How would they react to that? I don't think they'd be okay with that. This wouldn't instill confidence in the game. The same goes for our elections administration. Undue private influence distorts Americans' confidence in our elections. Zuckerbucks distorts confidence in our elections. It's why I'm working to ban Zuckerbucks. Since 2020, 27 states have recognized this problem and prohibited private funding of elections administration. In my home state of Wisconsin, measures to stop Zuckerbucks were passed in the Assembly and the Senate in 2021 and again in 2022. But our Democratic Governor, Tony Evers, vetoed those efforts. Mark Zuckerberg said his 2020 donation was a one-time thing. But left-wing groups like CTCL continue their partisan efforts. Today, we see the Center for Tech and Civic Life is in the midst of a 5-year, $80 million program called the U.S. Alliance for Elections Excellence. The new program is committed to distributing millions of dollars over the next 5 years to several states. There's a liberal bucket of states, including California, Connecticut, and Illinois. They're also going to states such as Nevada, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I asked my colleagues, what do those 3 states have in common? I'll give you a hint. They're presidential swing states that haven't banned Zuckerbucks. Why don't you see a state like Pennsylvania on the list, a key swing state? Their Democratic governor signed a ban on Zuckerbucks. So even some Democrats realize that this is a problem. In Congress, I have a solution to prevent undue private influence in elections administration. It's why this committee passed the American Confidence in Elections Act, which includes my friend Claudia Tenney's Ban Zuckerbucks bill. The legislation would end special federal tax treatment for organizations like the Center for Tech and Civic Life and their donors that seek to influence elections administration. And we have released the Model State ACE Act, a toolkit of model state legislation for states to consider. The toolkit includes strong reforms to prevent undue private influence in elections administration by banning donations directly to local elections offices. Today, I look forward from hearing from our witnesses who've written and researched the role Zuckerbucks and private funding can have on elections administration, and drawing attention to what steps Congress and our state legislators must take to resolve the crisis in confidence. Thank you. I'll now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for his opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Stile, and thank you for gathering us. As I begin, I can't resist pointing out the incredible role reversal we're hearing this morning. For the first time that I can remember, Republicans are haranguing public servants for accepting philanthropic assistance that enhance the efficiency and security of their official responsibilities. What an extraordinary flip-flop. This is the party that wants to privatize Social Security. This is the party that wants to privatize Medicare. The Republican Study Committee, to which almost all the majority members of this committee belong, released a proposed budget last year that called for the privatization of transportation through Amtrak and to the air traffic control functions of the FAA. So the majority's alleged concern about charitable foundation financing in the realm of election administration is disingenuous at best. Of course, we all know the reasons my colleagues across the aisle oppose this partnership. It's because President Trump lost the 2020 election fair and square, and the majority cannot and will not accept that fact. That's the reason we're here, using taxpayer funds for what is, by my count, this committee's 10th election-related hearing just this Congress, all to chase down debunked conspiracy theories. We should be crystal clear. We are only here today discussing this topic yet again because the endless tantrum the presumptive Republican nominee for president, his enablers in Congress, and his cronies in the right-wing media echo chamber continue to throw. They insist, with no evidence, that nonprofit grants supporting the urgent public health needs of election officials in 2020 in the face of a once-in-a-century pandemic was some nefarious partisan scandal and plot. If there's any scandal and plot here, it's how pitiful public support for election administration is in this country. This committee has heard repeatedly from election administrators how critically they need additional funding to run safe and secure elections. They have told us time and again about the significant costs conducting the elections that define the very soul of this country. Our elections, our democracy, our willingness to exchange views and ideas, to freely give voice to our passions and stand up for our convictions, our courage when elections don't go our way, to accept our losses with grace, humility, and an unwavering faith in the wisdom of voters, and the strength of our shared national story. These are the things that make America truly great. But shamefully, the majority in this Congress has turned a deaf ear to these American values and the public servants who uphold them. This majority is attacking transparent, nonprofit funding for election administration while doing nothing to stop the flow of billions of dollars of dark money that flood our politics and drown out the voices of everyday American voters. It is our duty as elected officials to listen. We should listen to voters who are tired of the big lie. We should listen to our consciences, and we should listen to the officials who do the precious work of election administration. We should labor together on their behalf. There's plenty of room for bipartisan agreement here. We can give administrators the funding they need. We can bolster our election system against foreign interference and the spread of mis- and disinformation. We can make it easier for every eligible voter to access and cast a meaningful ballot. We can address the growing threat AI poses to the security of our elections. Just last week, we had a productive bipartisan hearing on the issues and implications of AI on the legislative branch. We've only just begun to imagine the possible consequences of AI in the election space. The threat AI-generated election interference poses to the security of our democracy and to public officials is evident as demonstrated by the subversive AI robocalls that targeted New Hampshire voters just last month. Instead, we have again returned, predictably, tediously, to election denialism. If my majority colleagues are serious about ensuring the sanctity of American elections, they should ensure the public servants who uphold our democracy are fully funded and properly supported, rather than once again wasting time amplifying another disproven, discredited conspiracy theory. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I thank all of you for being here. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Today we have a one-witness panel. We welcome Dr. Will Flanders, Ms. Molly Hemingway, Dr. Scott Walter, and Dr. Zachary Moore. We appreciate being with us today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Let the record show that the witnesses answer in the affirmative. You may be seated. I'll now introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Dr. Will Flanders, is a research director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Dr. Flanders is a leading expert on the effects of private funds in public election administration. Dr. Flanders has conducted extensive research about the illegal mobile voting van that was used in my home state of Wisconsin. Our next witness, Ms. Molly Hemingway, is a journalist and national best-selling author. Ms. Hemingway has written extensively on how private funding has influenced the integrity of our elections. Her book on this issue has become a seminal text in understanding the impacts of such funding in our nation's elections. Our next witness, Mr. Scott Walter, is president of Capital Research Center. Mr. Walter has previously testified before Congress about the problem of foreign money in our elections, and he's published a number of articles on election law and influence private funding has on elections administration. Our final witness, Dr. Zachary Moore, is an associate professor at the University of Kansas. Dr. Moore's research focuses on cost analysis and accounting practices in government, including the cost of administering elections. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we've read your statements in full and they'll appear in full in the record. You're to limit your opening statements to 5 minutes. We'll now recognize you, Dr. Will Flanders, for 5 minutes.
The mic on? Okay, there we go. All right, thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify here today. First, I think it's important to set the table about where the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty stands on election integrity issues more broadly. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, Will, and I'm not talking about myself in the third person here, we're talking about the organization Will henceforth, conducted an assessment of the election that was referred to by the Wall Street Journal as the best assessment of what happened. We found that while almost certainly the number of votes that did not comply with existing legal requirements exceeded Joe Biden's margin of victory in Wisconsin, there was no evidence that we uncovered of widespread voter fraud. Indeed, President Biden likely received more votes from eligible voters in Wisconsin than did President Trump. That said, there are credible reasons that the 2020 election shook the faith of many Americans in the electoral process. With the justification of the COVID-19 pandemic, many systems and rules were unilaterally abandoned without following proper legislative procedure, and new techniques were used to drive targeted voter turnout that existed in legal gray areas. This called into question the fundamental fairness of the election process. It is some of these issues that I'm here to discuss today. The prospect of private funding of elections ought to be of concern to voters across the political spectrum. Take any of the conservative boogeymen of the left, the Koch brothers, for example, and imagine they're sending money directly to election officials almost entirely in conservative-leaning areas of the nation. I feel confident in predicting that the same folks who are now complacent would be complaining loudly about the injustice of it. Yet that is what is happening with the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL, funding. CTCL records for Wisconsin indicate that 216 communities across Wisconsin received a grant. Madison and Milwaukee, however, received a disproportionate share of the funding, about 45%, despite only representing about 14% of the state's population. In a statistical analysis, we compared the change in turnout between 2016 and 20 with whether or not a community received a CTCL grant. We found that communities that received a CTCL funding saw an increase in the number of votes for Democratic candidates in 2020 that was greater than in communities that did not receive the funding. On average, this works out to about 8,000 votes across the state of Wisconsin that can be correlated with CTCL funding. So while in our work we did dismiss what Representative Morelli called some conspiracy theories, like for example with the voting machines, this is a very real situation. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's also important to note that CTCL grants were likely legal under Wisconsin law at the time they were made. As was mentioned, there have been efforts to, in subsequent years, to ban these grants that have not been signed into law by the governor. We currently have a constitutional amendment that will be going on to the ballot this fall to let the voters decide whether or not we want this funding to continue. This is important because even if we took CTCL at their word that this was a nonpartisan process, it doesn't mean that the next person to engage in similar tactics will even have the slightest lip service given to nonpartisanship. What we can say for certain is that CTCL did provide funding for a program that was ultimately judged to be illegal. As was mentioned by Chairman Stile, before the 2021 elections, the city of Racine introduced a mobile voting unit. This unit was purchased with CTCL funding in 2021, and the stated purpose of the van was to park in various areas around the city and allow people to fill out absentee ballots. Will has a legal arm, and our legal arm believed that the van was illegal under Wisconsin law for a number of different reasons. What we'll focus on today was a Wisconsin statute on absentee voting that states no site may be selected which provides an advantage to any political party. While other absentee ballot drop-off locations are in fixed buildings, Racine's mobile voting unit presented unique problems when it came to election fairness. Using data from the 2016, 18, and 20 general elections, we tried to determine the average partisan makeup of each ward in Racine. We found as the share of Democratic voters in a ward increased, so did the expected number of locations of the voting van in that ward. Across wards that were ultimately used in the 2022 primary, a hypothetical ward with 100% Democratic voters was expected to have 0.25 more voting locations than a ward with 0% Democratic voters. Looking at the list of all possible van locations, that number increased to 2.25. There are any number of reasons that the sites may have been selected. In the worst case scenario for election integrity, they may have been strategically chosen to benefit aligned politicians. In a more favorable light, they may have been chosen randomly to disperse throughout the city. Nevertheless, in the eyes of the law, the reasoning is irrelevant. If the locations chosen benefited one party over the other, and the van did, then the van was illegal. In the end, both of these issues come back to the concept of fairness and an equal application of the law to every American, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. I hope that we can all agree it is in America's interest that those on both sides of the aisle have their faith restored in our electoral process. Unfair election practices like those being discussed today only serve to undermine that faith and lend credibility to those who put forth less defensible claims of election fraud. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we'll welcome any questions later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flanders. Ms. Molly Hemingway, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morell, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. The American system of self-governance is under attack. Instead of an election day where everyone votes at the same time and with the same full set of information, votes are counted quickly, and everyone promptly knows and trusts the outcome, we now have lengthy election seasons that can last months prior to and even after Election Day. The situation is so absurd that we have presidential and gubernatorial debates weeks after some people have already voted. Instead of having total security and a verifiable chain of custody for ballots being issued, cast, and counted, we flood addresses across the country with tens of millions of unsupervised mail-in ballots months ahead of elections, frequently to locations from which voters, if they're even alive, have long since moved. Instead of having election administration that is rigorously nonpartisan and impartial under the law, we have allowed the private takeover of government election offices by partisan oligarchs and their armies of activists who use those offices and their authorities to tilt the election toward favored candidates. Instead of voters being able to vote for the candidate of their choice, powerful interests backed by wealthy oligarchs are working to remove the most popular candidate and the ruling party's chief opponent from the ballot in a move reminiscent of Soviet Russia. And if that weren't enough, instead of the top candidates chosen by the people being able to fully engage in a vigorous campaign heading into an election, We have one side actively attempting to throw its opponent in prison and bankrupt his family, again, reminiscent of Soviet Russia. Instead of a system of rule of law that gives Americans the same rights and due process, the Department of Justice and other partisan actors are prosecuting their opposition, whether powerful or lowly, and doing so in places where partisan juries will ensure a quick conviction. Instead of a free and independent press that shares news and information to help inform voters, we have a press that is almost exclusively the arm of one political party and is so corrupt that it is willing to perpetrate hoax after hoax against opposition party members. Instead of a vibrant public square where Americans can debate issues and express their strongly held views, we have an elaborate censorship industrial complex where the government works hand in hand with tech oligarchs to suppress and blacklist debate on all the important issues that contribute to election outcomes. This is something I know firsthand because our government worked with tech companies to censor me for my election reporting. Allowing just one of these attacks to infect our electoral system would be a crisis. Allowing all of them at the same time is an existential threat to our system of self-government. In my best-selling book on how election administration has been co-opted by groups seeking political power, I reported on a new phenomenon in the 2020 election that has already severely eroded trust and needs to be addressed decisively. In the last presidential election, nonprofit groups with very strong ties to the Democrat Party and funded by one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful men, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, took over government election offices, most notably in the Democrat areas of swing states. Since then, the efforts by partisans to further infiltrate government election offices to ensure favorable outcomes have only increased. I look forward to answering questions about how the private oligarch takeover of elections is a threat to our system of self-government.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hemingway. Mr. Scott Walters, you're now recognized. Mr. Scott Walter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morell, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the honor of testifying. I'm president of the Capital Research Center, which studies how special interests engage in politics, especially through nonprofits. As people from across the political spectrum know, confidence in our elections needs strengthening. Your right to single out private funding of election offices, which was a scandal in 2020 and continues in the 2024 cycle. We at the Capital Research Center have published online all our data on the private funding of the 2020 election by the Center for Tech and Civic Life, or CTCL, the main conduit for the so-called Zuckerbucks. I don't want to relitigate the election, just learn from it. A few data high points first. The percentage of CTCL money that went to jurisdictions Biden won in the battleground states are Arizona, 75% Democrat, Pennsylvania, 83%, Michigan, 86%, Wisconsin, 90%, Georgia, 94%, Nevada, 100%. Mr. Chairman, in your state of Wisconsin, CTCL gave out 188 of its minimum $5,000 grants. It gave out 31 larger grants, 3 to counties, 28 to cities. 20 of those 28 cities were won by candidate Biden, only 8 by candidate Trump. Those 20 Biden cities received 90% of CTCL's dollars in your state. A similar grotesque skewing is seen when we compare the per capita spending in those over $5,000 grants. The average per capita spend in Trump jurisdictions, 55 cents. The average in Biden jurisdictions, $3.75, nearly 7 times higher. No wonder the majority of states now ban or restrict such private funding of election offices. No wonder every single governor who's tried to thwart his democratically elected legislature's desire to ban such funding has been a Democrat. No wonder the Wyoming Secretary of State wrote all his county clerks warning them about CTCL, its desires past and present to influence elections with, quote, misleading tactics, and its possible funding from foreign sources. In my home state of Virginia, the opposition to such funding was unanimous in the Senate. Neither party wanted out-of-state billionaires controlling our elections. Yet CTCL ignores this widespread opposition to its agenda and turns instead to ever more insidious schemes to influence elections. Its response to criticism is merely cosmetic. The same day newspaper headlines announced Mark Zuckerberg said he'd never repeat his 2020 election funding, CTCL announced an $80 million rebrand of itself as the Alliance for Election Excellence. The latest effort to ensnare local government offices is no less objectionable. The Honest Elections Project has documented the Alliance's infiltrations of 2 North Carolina counties where CTCL aimed to provide in-kind services that may escape existing private funding bans, and also aimed to receive in-kind services from government offices, including data on voting and offices' internal operations. More recently, CTCL has been discovered scheming to have local offices seek federal disaster funding from FEMA, presumably because the federal government has even more billions than Mr. Zuckerberg, and because this, too, may circumvent private funding bans while promoting, as one observer put it, quote, the same sort of technical, data-driven, and activist-led manipulation of the election system in favor of Democrats that CTCL mounted in 2020. CTCL will claim it just wants to help Americans vote, but consider a Super Bowl analogy similar to the chairman's. Election offices are the referees of American elections, and the parties are the teams trying to score. If you heard the refs in the Super Bowl were aiming to boost the total points scored, would you feel better about the game's fairness? What if you learned the refs were receiving money and training from people who previously worked for one team's offensive coaching staff? Most Americans would say, wait a minute, scoring points is the job of the teams, not the refs. And if the refs were being influenced by alumni of one team, confidence in the Super Bowl would plummet. Well, the people who founded and still run CTCL came from a group the Washington Post gushed was, quote, the Democratic Party's Hogwarts of digital wizardry. Unknown during 2020, CTCL also received $25 million on top of Zuckerberg's millions from the Democratic Party's biggest dark money network, run by Arabella Advisors, and every year receiving millions of dollars from the foreign billionaire Hans Wies. I don't want either party's operatives playing the refs, and I know Americans won't be confident in elections as long as this scam continues.
Thank you, Mr. Walter. Dr. Zachary Moore, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
I think it's when the light.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. For over a decade, I've studied local government accounting practices, and starting 8 years ago, my team and I specifically started looking at the cost of local elections administration. This research guides my comments today. First, I want everyone to recognize that local election administration is often underfunded and to understand why it is underfunded. Secondly, most of us in the election administration community would also agree that local election jurisdictions would benefit greatly from federal funding. To improve the discussion on this topic, I sketch out 3 principles that I think would be helpful in guiding discussions of funding for elections administration. It surprises most people to realize how large and varied the election system is in the United States. In federal elections, there are over 8,000 local election jurisdictions that are responsible both legally and financially for conducting elections. Cities, towns, villages, townships, and 2 states are the local units of government that actually conduct elections. Who conducts elections and how elections are conducted vary significantly by the state. Likewise, the funding of these election jurisdictions varies dramatically. Most use regular local sources like property tax and sales tax. Some dedicated tax sources and some have charges for local governments. A few states provide reimbursements and cost sharing. There have been very few studies on the financing of elections administration. One thing that most of us that study this topic agree is that elections administration is underfunded. Why is elections administration underfunded? Put simply, political leaders have to make trade-offs in the face of constrained and limited local government resources. Some services like education and public safety are just more visible than elections administration. We can see in our data that elections administration spending, when we adjust for inflation, has not risen significantly and is responsive to the economic cycle, which isn't a good thing. The sad truth is that local funding underfunds election administration. What is needed is regular, equitable, and meaningful funding for elections. For most of the history of the United States, funded elections through its local governments. This was probably as much a fact of pragmatic necessity as it was a part of its governing theory. Until the 20th century, many states and local governments were better funded than the federal government. However, in the 21st century, the federal government has funded election administration 4 times in 2003, 2018, 2020, and 2022. I would argue that this funding should be regular and consistent so that local governments can count on it and that market forces can adjust accordingly. The amount of federal funding also needs to be meaningful. Although the cost estimates vary based on who is included and how the dollars are counted, academic research puts the amount spent by the local election jurisdictions on election administration in the range of $1.5 billion to $5 billion per year. Ideally, the federal government would pay a meaningful share of this cost. While federal offices may appear on the ballot every other year, the reality is that the cost of maintaining voter registration lists, training, and maintaining equipment happen every year, and these costs do not go away in the years where no federal office is on the ballot. Finally, the funding of election administration needs to be equitable. One surprising fact from our research into election administration is that the cost is often the highest in rural areas. The reason for this is simple. There are high fixed costs of voting and fewer people in these jurisdictions. There are many ways that the federal government could split the cost of election administration with state and local governments. And in recent years, I have heard some in the election administration community just say to keep it simple and ask legislators for just $1 per voter. $1. I do think we need to keep the cost structure in mind. Perhaps we need to raise what we would give to the smaller local governments, but I think this is important. These comments build on comments I plan to make at the Election Administration Symposium at the University of Kansas next week. I'll build on these comments and flesh out these ideas further. I want to thank the Dole Institute and its partner, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, for beginning this conversation on the topic of election funding with academics and practitioners. I've been thinking about the election cost structure and how it's changing for years, and the invitation to discuss election funding from this bipartisan group is extremely welcome. I want to encourage you all to follow the lead of these 2 institutions and approach this topic in a bipartisan manner. I hope you find these comments useful, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Go Chiefs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. We'll now begin questioning our witnesses. We're going to begin with the chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee, Mr. Loudermilk. I'll remind we have a full roster on the committee, which is great. We have a standing room only in the back. I will be strict on the 5 minutes so that everyone gets their opportunity to question our witnesses prior to votes. I'll now recognize Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my questions, I'd like to submit for the record an article from the New York Post by Mrs. Hemingway, entitled Facts About the Zuckerbucks, How He Helped Swing the Electorate in 2020.
Without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Very important topic. It's one thing that you'll find very interesting being in this committee. There's often a lot of rhetoric from our friends on the other side of the dais about how Republicans can't seem to get over Donald Trump's loss in the 2020 election. But it's always them that bring it up. It appears that it's more that they are having a problem getting over it, not us. The fact is, why we're having these hearings is you have to recognize that the American people have a significant distrust in our election system. Right or wrong, we need to address that. There are instances of voter fraud. Whether there was a significant amount to swing the 2020 election or not is still up to for the debate. But we have to make sure that elections are equitable and they're fair. Regarding human nature, there's an old adage that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, inevitably the people are going to believe it. But on the other hand, the truth is not always popular, and it's often very difficult to obtain, but it is always the truth, and that's what we're looking for here. Ms. Hemingway, I want to turn to CLTC grants that were given to my home state of Georgia, a state that President Biden won by a little over 11,000 votes. And according to the Foundation for Government Accountability, Georgia received $31 million in Zuckerbucks for the general election. Ms. Hemingway, why did Georgia receive nearly 9% of all Zuckerbucks when only 3% of the population of the country lives here? Did every county in Georgia get Zuckerbucks?
Thank you, Mr. Loudermilk. So it does seem that CTCL targeted Georgia more than most other states. They got a disproportionate amount of the funding that other states got. And CTCL likes to say, well, we gave to Republican states and to Democrat states. And in a sense, that's true. And CEIR, which is the partner organization, also gave a lot of money to Georgia. But they were targeting states that might be able to be flipped, and I think Georgia is a great example. It's a state that went 5 points for Donald Trump in 2016 after the influence of the Zuckerbucks funding that targeted the blue areas of Georgia. Georgia went, by 11,000 votes or so for Joe Biden. And it was just a long targeted project to influence the outcome of that state, it appears.
I don't mean to interrupt, but if they were taunting that they're giving to Republican states as well, to be equitable, that would indicate to me that out of 159 Georgia counties, 159 counties would have received some funding. But from what I recall, they only provided grants to 43 of those counties, with Trump voting counties receiving an average of $1.91 per registered voter, while Biden voting counties received $7.13 per voter. Is that true?
Exactly. So in addition to them getting the largest percentage of funding of any state, you look at it on a county-by-county basis, and counties where they were attempting to get more votes out of Democrat voting counties got dramatically more funding than the Republican-based counties. And again, the targeting was in areas where they thought they could get the most votes.
So Democrat-leaning counties got 4 times the amount of Republican-leaning counties. Do you know why?
I would love to hear what they have to say about that.
Me as well. So what were the differences in the counties that received Zuckerbucks versus those that did not, other than they were more blue counties than red? I mean, they were more blue than red. Is there any other logical reason why they would receive more funds?
I can't answer that.
Okay. Do you have any idea how Fulton, Cobb, and DeKalb counties used their Zuckerbucks?
So Zuckerbucks were sold as a way to deal with the COVID crisis. You remember what it was like in 2020. We had government shutdowns everywhere. And it was very controversial, actually, at first to see Mark Zuckerberg, one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful men, coming into our election administration. But the way it was kind of pitched was, well, people need help buying personal protective equipment. And so people thought, well, I guess that makes sense that voting administration might need some help. Instead, I think it was only single digits, low single digits, that went to anything COVID-related like that. Instead, it was about ginning up, get out the vote efforts through the election administration office, again, in areas that were more likely to vote Democrat. And it really does make a profound difference when you're applying that to one group of people and not to others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Morelli is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to ask to enter into the record 2 articles, one by the Wisconsin Examiner about the Yulin family, owners of a Wisconsin company that gave millions to the January 6th March for Trump, which preceded the attack on the U.S. Capitol, as well as an article from the New York Times. These conservatives have a laser focus, owning the libs, which details, although it has been identified by 2 people with knowledge of the finances of the group. The Federalists indicate that Mr. Yulin is also a significant contributor to the Federalists. Since we're just making connections here, I'll enter those into the record. And let me, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. And if I might, let me just begin by asking the members of the panel, I'll do this quickly rather than asking each of you. Please raise your hand if you believe Donald Trump won the 2020 election. Just for the record, I please let the record note that each of the 4 witnesses believes that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. Let me begin, and I apologize, there's a lot of questions in a short time, but Professor Moore, I understand from your testimony you're working on a book called A Republic, If You Can Afford It. How much does it cost to administer an election? I think it's an incredibly important question, and one Congress sometimes overlooks or ignores, or maybe just doesn't fully understand. Can you give us some detail on the full costs based on your work of administering elections in the United States? And you can divide it by federal versus state, however you're looking at it.
Yeah, can you hear me? The mic, okay, there, the mic's on. So this isn't just something that Congress has a hard time wrapping its arms around. Because local governments do elections administration, this has been something that's been overlooked in the literature for years and years and years. And so we're just now getting a handle on that. My team and I, we look at the annual financial reports, and we look at the audited financial statements to see the total expenditures of local governments, because local governments are the governments that are spending or are doing elections administration. So our estimates are a lower bound estimate, but we estimate it somewhere in the cost every year of about $2 billion. So elections administration actually costs a lot of money. I think that's a misperception by a lot of people that don't understand how big elections administration is in the United States. But I would say that because we look at expenditures, that $2 billion estimate is absolutely the lower bound estimate there.
Hey, just as a follow-up, you've identified, I think we all know, that most of that cost is borne by local governments, who all have different capacities to be able to fund elections. Does it affect not only the quality, but does it affect the degree to which it is a standardized approach to elections in all communities around the country, urban, rural, suburban, et cetera?
Actually, there's wide variation in the amount that gets spent across the country. On average, in the lowest spending states, it may be $2 or $3 per voter, or registered voter rather, and in the highest spending states, it's more like $20 per voter.
And would you suggest that affects the ability or the quality of the ability of local election officials to carry out their responsibilities?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the ability to have the money that you need to buy the equipment, enter into the contracts that you need, have polling places, pay people, all of it matters.
Is there, in your opinion, more that the federal government ought to be doing to guarantee a floor, in effect, of support for local election officials across the country in areas that are red, blue, purple, and anywhere in between?
Yeah, as my statements indicate, I really think that with states banning private funding, which, you know, there may be valid reasons for that, but if that is going to be the case, elections administration has been underfunded for years. Now it is getting critically underfunded because, it just doesn't have the resources that it needs. So we need the federal government to step in here.
And does your organization have any recommendations on what the level of funding ought to be from Congress? As an appropriator, I'd be curious if do you anticipate having a degree of recommendation on what we ought to do to be able to support local election officials across the country?
So the people I work with, Martha Croft, Mary Jo McGowan at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, they're great people. I'm not speaking for them today. I'm only speaking for myself. When I hear in the election administration community at least $1, I think that should be the floor. I think we should start at $1 for all communities, and then based on cost structure, adjust accordingly. Because some of these smaller jurisdictions are spending $10, $11 on average. So it really needs to be increased for those larger.
Well, I'll be looking to see if there's recommendations on that, and I would just suggest that it would be unnecessary for philanthropic organizations to contribute to elections if there was adequate funding and we could guarantee that, which I would clearly support. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Griffith is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Moore, I'm going to continue to go with you on that same theme because I like the way you think. Even if we might disagree on some of it, I like the way you think because my district is more than 9,000 square miles in size. I have 28 jurisdictions, and some of those counties are pretty darn large. And so, and I got all kinds of mountains in there too. So it takes, you know, what might look like only about 9 or 10 miles on a map might be a 45-minute to an hour drive because you've got to cross a mountain to get from one town to the next in the same county. So you're saying $1 per voter, and then I appreciate, and this is the part I like the most, recognizing that if you're in Arlington County, Virginia, which is very compact, very populous, you might not need as much money as you would need in Buchanan County. Would you agree with that? Which is a larger county with mountains in it and a smaller population.
Yeah, so the data absolutely bears this out, that the more rural counties, like you said, you have to get people different further, and you have to spread them out in polling places, and so that all costs more per voter. So yes, I think that we need to recognize that.
And I think I heard in your testimony as well that you recognize that if you have some disparities in there, you need to adjust for that. So this is where I go to Mr. Walter's data. Buchanan County, Virginia receives 60 cents in the Zuckerbucks arena. Arlington County receives $1.08. Arlington County is part of the 8th Congressional District, which has a PVI rating of 26 or 27. The 9th District of Virginia, the district I represent, has a PVI of R23. Doesn't it strike you as a little unusual that in the entire 9th District, of the 7 jurisdictions out of 28 that got money, Washington County got the most at 50 cents a voter. Arlington got $1.08. Fairfax got $1.08. PVI 26, PVI 23, PVI 26 gets the lion's share of the money. Doesn't that strike you as odd? If you're trying to set up a system that's just trying to get people to vote?
It doesn't strike me as remotely equitable. It also doesn't strike me as being aimed at, in fact, equitable funding in elections.
Which I appreciate Dr. Moore's for. He's for that. So I'm not criticizing him at all. I think that he has some valid issues that we need to deal with. I thought it was very interesting because in the entirety of the 9th District, which covers that 9,000 square miles, we got $78,053, whereas Arlington County got $238,643. Is that accurate, or is that comport with your data?
Yes.
I'm taking it
all
off,
the
I think,
data's
your chart.
online for anyone to check who likes.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's just shocking. And let me say, I know lots of people want to go to a partisan mischief. I don't have to go there. The system was set up poorly. It may have been partisan. It may not have been. Because what could have happened is they just put the money in, and then they created a system which, and you know how we all politicians, we know how to do this. You tweak the way the system works. You make it so the bigger counties and cities are going to get the money because they have the grant writers, and they can check the right boxes to get more money. They can say, oh, we need X, Y, and Z, whereas a rural county may not be able to do that. For example, in Scott County, Virginia, a couple of years ago, and there's a fight in the county as to whether they could or couldn't have, but the Board of Supervisors turned down a bunch of state money because it had a matching requirement, and they didn't feel like they could afford the match. And so you run into those problems as well, don't you?
No, exactly, although I would point out, if you go to the IRS website, it's very clear that charities cannot have the effect, whether or not they had the intention, of helping one party in an election.
Well, and I don't think there's any question that, at least in my home state of Virginia, a heck of a lot more money flowed to the Democrat jurisdictions. I believe the number's 90% of the money went to the Democrat-leaning jurisdictions as opposed to 10% for the non-Democrat-leaning jurisdictions. And whether that was their intent or not, the result creates an unfair game. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have serious objection to today's hearings and the partisan nature in which I think that we're setting this up. Even the title, Confronting Zuckerbucks, Private Funding of Election Administration. I think all of us can agree that no private funding should be funding our elections. It should be public funding, and it should be adequate funding. As ranking member of the Election Subcommittee and the author and sponsor of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I understand deeply the importance of safe, secure, and accessible elections. As someone who was raised in Selma, Alabama, and learned at the feet of foot soldiers such as John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson, the very importance of the right to vote, I really have no tolerance for the unrelenting assault on voting rights perpetrated by the partisan and extreme organizations represented by today's Republican witnesses. Dr. Flanders' law firm, known as Will, was involved in a 2019 lawsuit seeking to purge 200,000 voters from the rolls in Wisconsin. Will has litigated to restrict voting rights and advance Republican interests. I'd like to submit for the record an article from the Democracy document entitled "The Little-Known Wisconsin Legal Group Wreaking Havoc on Democracy." Will is funded by, Will is funded by the Bradley Foundation, a dark money group that has spent millions to restrict voter rights and to stoke election denial. Ms. Hemingway's organization allegedly included a, quote, black crime tag on articles it published documenting crimes allegedly perpetrated by Black Americans. Their website has also made numerous false claims of widespread voter fraud. One of their major funders is a billionaire who also funded the January 6th pro-Trump rally that preceded the horrible attacks on our Capitol of January 6th. With records like these, I believe that these witnesses are not qualified to talk about election integrity. On average, administering a presidential election costs anywhere from $2 to $3 billion, but Congress has only helped to offset 4% of these expenses. Herein lies the problem. Congress has only provided financial assistance 3 times in the past 2 decades, amounting to a mere drop in the bucket of what is needed to equitably run elections and protect election workers and secure our democracy for all Americans. Inadequate funding of elections has significant consequences in minority, rural, and underserved communities throughout America, especially in my district. Voters are forced to wait in long lines, poll locations are changed without notice, polling stations and polling sites run out of ballots hours before they are set to close, and election workers face increasing threats to their very lives. Instead of spending our time and resources focusing on these issues, I believe we're wasting our time exploring false narratives about the big lie of a stolen 2020 presidential election and false narratives about American voters. Mr. Chairman, we need to focus on ending voter suppression. In one example, conservative activists made unlawful robocalls to Black voters in Detroit in the run-up to the 2020 election. They told potential voters that if they voted by mail, their personal information would be provided in a public database used by police departments to track down old warrants and be used by credit card companies to collect outstanding debts. These 2 activists were later fined by the FEC, but it underscores how far conservative extremism will go to keep Black voters from voting. After taking control of Twitter, Elon Musk dismantled the platform's system for flagging false election content. He has a history of promoting unsubstantiated voter fraud allegations and interference threats. The list goes on, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to submit for the record and seek unanimous consent for the various articles that prove that point. In closing, I just want to remind all of us that we have a great opportunity, this committee, to actually fund public funding of elections and restore integrity. We should be focused on that and not on partisan politics. I think it's really important that we take charge of what we can control, which is public funding.
May I
Thank you.
respond?
Go back.
The gentlewoman yields back. There'll be time for the witness in a moment. Dr. Murphy's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not interested in re-adjudicating the 2020 election. It's done. It's done. I'm going to like to submit for the record an opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal, Zuckerbucks shouldn't pay for elections.
Without objection.
I just want to read the first line. The 2020 pandemic election wasn't stolen, but it sure was a super spreader of bad precedents. Okay? That's just where we're going to start with. And I think that is a very bipartisan statement. You know, I don't think I agree with Ms. Sewell's, several of her comments. I don't want this. I think we need to help our rural areas and understaffed areas, absolutely. But it is an absolute uncontroverted fact that Zuckerbucks, through the millions and millions of dollars that went to one side versus the other. I mean, with what Mr. Griffiths just stated, the numbers, the amount that were said, you can't. The facts are not up to debate on those individuals, on those places. And so I'd love us to not have any outside interference. God forbid we're going to have it from China, we're going to have it from Russia. We don't need it from our own huge wealthy individuals that want to play, puppeteer to what's happening with the masses. We want these free, we want these fair elections in the United States. We go around the world touting that we want to be able to monitor elections in other countries. That's nonsense when we can't really handle our own, with so many different forces that go through there. Mr. Walter, if I can, you had mentioned a few North Carolina counties. North Carolina is obviously my home state. In this past election year, Governor Cooper, Democrat Governor Cooper, tried to veto the Senate Bill 747, which basically banned the Zuckerbucks, banned outside interference. Of course, fortunately, it was overridden. It was just it was election reforms, basically not allowing this nonsense. I wonder if you could extrapolate or expand on that a little bit in some of the counties in North Carolina.
Well, a couple things I would say. One is that, again, the majority of American states have voted to ban or restrict private funding of elections. I'm not aware of a single state anywhere that has ever even attempted to make it legal to do such a thing. So, again,
now, it's my understanding that Zuckerberg has said he's not going to do this again.
He has. Now, the unfortunate problem is the Center for Tech and Civic Life has not given up. And so, as I said, they concocted a rebranding of themselves, Alliance for Election Excellence. And there's, you may want to enter into the record the excellent report on what happened in North Carolina that the John Locke Foundation and Honest Elections Project produced, with internal emails from things like Brunswick County, where they were colluding with the Center for Tech and Civic Life. In fact, they were you had election officials publishing over their name op-eds that in fact were written by the Center for Tech and Civic Life. So again, you see this insidious infiltration and manipulation.
It's just unfortunate because I want Buddy to be fair. I think everybody in this room, bipartisan, absolutely. We want it to be fair. We want people to be able to present their ideas of what is right, what they believe, rather than having interference from people on telephone calls or any other type of things. It is just sad here in this particular instance, and this is what this committee is meeting about today, is that Mark Zuckerberg, through his wealth, tried to influence things to one partisan side. I was just reading an article about what his charities are. and they're primarily Democratic. I mean, that's just a fact. People can have their own charities one way or the other. It's just what they do. It's not an issue, it's their money. But the fact that this is being done one particular side versus the other in an election is wrong, period, point blank. And I would say the exact same thing. I would say the exact same thing if it were a Republican person. I promise you I would say the exact same thing. And this does belie the fact that Americans now overwhelmingly question what's going on in our election. Again, this is not to re-adjudicate the 2020 election, but it is the purpose of this committee and this Congress is to help restore confidence for all Americans, regardless of their political proclivities, is to restore that to our country. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Torres is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start by saying that on a personal level, I do have a lot of respect for you. But when we are presented with hearings like this, with these types of witnesses, it really puts into question the leadership of this committee and where we are going and our mutual goal to try to get things done for the American people. It is really unfortunate that we are where we are, and I do want to believe that you truly, truly want to get to the bottom of how do we stop super PACs, how do we stop charities, how do we stop nonprofit organizations, whatever we want to call them, from or people who are billionaires to influence in our elections. But we have to do that with some common courtesy and with witnesses that are believable, witnesses that have some credibility. I'm going to try really hard here today to try to stick to an agenda that I think you try to put together for us, and try to show some civility where civility has not been shown. I want to start by saying that the Federal Election Committee voted unanimously, including all 3 Republicans commissioners, to find that there was no reason to believe that Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg violated any federal law. Republican commissioners and Democratic commissioners voted that they found no evidence to that. So to continue to steer this notion that there is something where there was nothing is what causes people to believe that we should question every election. And while we should question people's motives that are working for us as election workers, we should never put them in danger, endanger their lives, and we should never cause an insurrection to try in an effort to cancel minority votes. I think that is just the most despicable thing that anyone could try to pivot to say that it is the decent thing to do because you disagree with how the election was done. Professor Moore, to your knowledge, were there partisan requirements for election administrators to receive the Center for Technology and Civic Life election grants?
No, there were not.
Were Republican-governed jurisdictions provided with CTCL grants?
Yes.
Do you have a general understanding of what the CTCL grants were spent on? If so, where did the money go?
Yeah, they went to a variety of things. It went to personal protective equipment like this pen that has a point that you can touch the screen with or you can write with. We forget about that this was a pandemic and these were small things that made a difference. They also bought new equipment and other PPE, but by and large, it was things like that, simple things.
Protective equipment for the staff, maybe masks, maybe
Yeah.
other safety equipment, gloves.
Oh, and wages. They often would provide 20 or 30 extra dollars for each day. So that's what I have seen in talking with people, what they used it for.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I also seek unanimous consent that this article by Ranking Member Morelli and Brian Lemek, which ran on the Hill, 2024 promises to be a contentious Congress, must support election workers now.
Without objection.
Thank you. Professor Moore, in your study of the cost of election administration, have you come across any information regarding the burden that the spread of misinformation or disinformation causes in our community?
Well, I think in terms of costs, it does have an impact, an indirect impact in the fact that these costs are to the people that conduct elections, and a lot of elections administrators, election workers are getting out of the business because.
The
My
gentleman's
time
time's
is up.
expired. We
back.
asked you to respond in writing. I will note, because it was a question on the hearing, I think it's relevant to know that we're not talking about whether or not a law was broken. I think we're talking about whether or not we should change the law.
Right.
And I think that's really important. As we heard earlier, Ms. Sewell, who had to step out, as I interpreted her words, she said that there shouldn't be private funds in elections. We've seen a number of states change policies to block private funds because it questions, so many people have questions when they see these private funds come in. And so I don't think it's a question of whether or not a behavior was illegal. I think the question presented today is actually on the law that was passed by this committee, the bill that was passed by this committee, as to whether or not our government should allow private funds into the administration of the election. Now recognize Ms. Bice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I find it incredibly disturbing that my colleague would question the validity of the witnesses that we have before us today. We have a PhD, we have an author and editor-in-chief of a very well-known online publication. We have a Global Research Center executive who was also special assistant to President Bush. So to question the validity of the witnesses is incredibly disturbing to me. Ms. Hemingway, you wanted to respond to Ms. Sewell's comments earlier, and I'd like to give you that opportunity now.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave aside Ms. Sewell's embrace of censorship and attacks on journalism and journalists, because I believe those are self-discrediting. But both she and Ms. Torres either said or insinuated that voting integrity harms minority voting outcomes. That's actually a falsehood. Caring about election integrity is something that you should do, you should just do because it's important that we have free and fair elections that people trust. But as you saw when Georgia and Florida passed mild election integrity reforms in recent years, they actually saw voting participation skyrocket or increase heavily. And so that's just a common lie or falsehood that's said, and I just wanted to correct that.
Thank you for the clarification. I want to also ask, can you talk a little bit about what you think is happening with the 2024 elections? And you know, you referenced that there's money coming in through different avenues. As far as Mr. Alter, you referenced that. But can you talk a little bit about what you think is happening in the 2024 election, Ms. Hemingway or Mr. Roll, either one?
Well, as I said, you have the CTCL's rebranding of itself as the Alliance for Election Integrity, which is attempting to use both regular funds, but especially in-kind contributions and so-called credits that can only be spent at their partner organizations. So you have that. The other big problem you have is the voter registration project, which is a C3 close to here. They also did this kind of thing, except not through election offices, but simply through left-wing get-out-the-vote groups. And again, getting out the vote's a wonderful thing if it's a political party doing it, or if it's a C4 doing it, or a super PAC. It is an outrageous thing if it's charitable dollars from foundations and donor-advised funds being used by 501c3 charities. That is not legal.
Thank you. Ms. Hemingway?
I would just add another thing to have on this committee's radar would be how President Biden, like 2 months after he entered office, signed an executive order calling for each federal agency to kind of get involved in these types of things as well. And that is something, given the nature of our current bureaucracy, the permanent Washington, D.C. class, and something that we had previously kind of, again, wanted to keep separate because political parties are involved in getting out the vote for their particular candidates. And so many abuses can be done when you're using taxpayer dollars in, again, a partisan fashion.
Thank you. In Oklahoma, there was approximately $2.8 million that counties received from Zuckerbucks, according to the Foundation for Government Accountability. But because of that and the questions surrounding how those dollars were being used, House Bill 3046 was passed, which was authored by my former colleague, Mark Lepak, to prohibit private funding of elections. And I think that we now have over 25 states that have enacted some sort of legislation to prevent this. I fully recognize, having been in the state legislature prior to being elected to Congress, that funding for elections is challenging. And we should be looking at how we do that better. But I would also argue that we need to be mindful of essentially giving additional federal dollars to states that I don't think are administering those elections well, and I would use California as one of those examples. Why would I want to fund an election process that I think is broken? States like Florida, during the 2000 election cycle, recognized they had a problem. We all remember the hanging chads situation, but they rectified it. They realized that they wanted to build confidence in their elections. The mail-in balloting process, the drop box process, I think is very flawed. Oklahoma doesn't do that, and I'm very proud of the way that we structure our elections because we know that there's confidence in the outcome. And so while I do think that we should look at funding, I think that we need to be mindful of the process. Dr. Moore, any thoughts there?
Yeah,
Quickly.
You mentioned Florida. When they realized they had a problem, they also had to start spending more. So we need to encourage that, okay?
On the states, thank you.
Yeah.
I yield.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Kerry is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman. I also want to thank the ranking member, and I do want the witnesses to do appreciate you guys coming in. And though you may see different questions and line of questioning from both sides, I do want you to know that my dear friends on the other side are friends, and they're very talented legislators that are doing the job that they need to be doing and asking the questions that they want to ask. Mr. Flanders, I want to say, before the 2020 election, did the states or localities accept private monetary donations to help them with elections administration?
Yeah, so, while there could be some small example that, for a dog catcher race or something like that, we're not aware of any widespread funding of elections, certainly not to the level that we saw with the CTCL funding. So the answer to that is no, as far as I know. Okay, so should public officials be accepting donations from organizations like the CTCL in the first place? Yeah, so I think what we've heard today, and even from some folks on the other side, right, is that there are concerns when this money is being provided to local election officials, and I think the answer is absolutely not. And it's good to hear that there might be some bipartisan agreement on that question. Okay, so what are let's go back to this. What are some of the dangers that you could see that are associated with accepting this funds? Yeah, so I think what we see here is, and you can put aside the sort of whether or not this was strategic. I think we mostly would say that it was strategic, but say these grants were provided just to larger communities because they thought larger cities needed more help. Well, that does lead to a partisan bias in the outcomes, and I think we're on a slippery slope here. Again, you could take them at their word. You could take CTCL at their word that they did this in a nonpartisan way, but without legal changes, there's nothing to say the next person who does this will even give any lip service whatsoever to doing this in a nonpartisan way, and there's no limitation on that.
With that, does accepting private funds for alleged purposes of election administration increase voters' confidence in election process or the result, in your opinion?
Absolutely not. There's some polling from last year. I saw a 2022 poll that the majority of Americans think this funding should be banned, and I think when people learn more about the process, as we're doing here today, those numbers would even go up higher.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Walder, CTCL's U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence has targeted several counties across the United States, seeking for them to enter into membership agreements. Can you describe how this played out in certain counties in Georgia and in Arizona?
Sure. Well, one recent example in Georgia caused the legislature to enact a second ban on Zuckerbucks. The ban had been that you couldn't send money into the election office, so CTCL disingenuously then sent the money to the county government with the plan that it would then send it to the election office. The state legislature responded quickly, and that is now forbidden in the state of Georgia.
So it's my understanding that the Alliance has also targeted Forsyth County and Brunswick County in North Carolina. What do you think they're targeting in those counties?
Well, again, it perfectly fits the pattern of trying to turn out Democrats in the elections. And the other thing that it does is it helps them to, they go to these counties and they say, we're going to help you. We're going to provide you with in-kind contributions. And by the way, we're also going to give you an improvement plan for your office. Now, again, outside groups should not be trying to run the government election offices. That's a simple principle.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank everybody that's here to testify today, and I want to thank the members of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. D'Esposito is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record 2 separate articles. The first from the Honest Elections Project, Zuckerbucks 2.0, the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, exposing the left's latest attempt to influence the election process.
Objection.
The second is from the Daily Signal, how one Georgia county skirted Zuckerbucks' ban to bank $2 million in an election grant.
Without objection.
Mr. Walter, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, the group Mark Zuckerberg gave millions of dollars to during the 2020 election, recently embarked on a 5-year, $80 million project called the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. Is the alliance orchestrating a direct scheme to override state bans for Zuckerbucks and private funding of election administration? And if so, how can the alliance get around such regulations?
Well, it certainly is. As I said, sometimes they're attempting to get around bans by giving to a different part of a government instead of the election office. Sometimes they're offering in-kind contributions. Sometimes they're offering so-called credits that can only be spent with their partners, some of whom are part of the Arabella Advisors dark money network that receives foreign influence cash.
Okay. Now, do you know who or where they'll target?
Well, they've targeted a number of different places. It's interesting to see Greenwich, Connecticut, for instance, was one place they targeted, and it was very controversial there, and the town decided to refuse to accept membership in the alliance, although they did take the money.
Right. So when counties and localities become members of the alliance, what, if anything, do they actually promise the alliance?
Typically, they have to promise the alliance that they're going to share lots of their voting data and also data on their internal operations, because the alliance wants to manipulate the way the government offices operate internally.
Seems pretty fair. Mr. Flanders, Dr. Flanders, I'm sorry. We know that 27 states have now enacted legislation prohibiting Zuckerbucks or the private funding of our elections. But in some states like Wisconsin and Michigan, Democrat governors have vetoed the legislation. Why have they vetoed these bills, and why do you believe the states should prioritize oversight over private money infiltrating election administration?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is what we see here today, that this issue that is a very real issue is being conflated with many other election integrity issues. And I think that on the part of our own state, speaking about Wisconsin, Governor Evers has a track record of sort of refusing to implement any sort of reforms to election integrity. That, and you can even go to another level and say potentially they see the benefits of continuing this funding, given what we see in the election results where it has been beneficial to folks on the left.
Okay, and obviously they tried to sell it as Zuckerbucks being this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic idea, then why shouldn't these bills pass overwhelmingly?
Yeah, you would think so, right? If it's just for the pandemic, we are past the pandemic, thankfully. But what we see is that municipalities didn't even spend all the money that they received. The Racine voting ban that we discussed in the beginning wasn't even used until elections post-2020. So I think there's no reason to think that even if it's not CTCL, there might be others that'll engage in similar activity in the future without the excuse of the pandemic.
So it seems like with the infiltration of Zuckerbucks, in some places, pure common sense has gone away.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hemingway, I'd like to return to a subject you spoke about just a moment ago. Several times today, we've heard allegations that election integrity measures are tantamount to voter suppression, and that many of the things that we're talking about here today have some sort of effect that is negative on voter turnout. So I think it's important that we address that and that we address it thoroughly. Would you tell us a little bit more? You know, for example, when I was Secretary of State, quite frequently we were subjected to litigation, activist litigation, insinuating that any of our integrity measures were suppressing the vote, where those lawsuits weren't brought in other states, some of which had more restrictive voting laws than did Florida. So I'm interested in your thoughts about those subjects.
Right. Well, it's interesting also to just think about the context in which we first talk about this. So it is true that a political party, the Democrat Party, actually worked to suppress the black vote throughout the South for decades. And they didn't do it by just like banning outright. They did it through manipulation of election administration in different municipalities. And so people are concerned about that. But it is also true that we have higher, voter turnout now than we've had in a very long time. People are doing and that caring about election integrity is an important part of our entire self-governance system. We need to be sure that people who are voting are legal and eligible to vote, and that when you have people who are voting who might not fit certain categories, it actually disenfranchises legal and eligible voters. So it's actually important to care about it for all of our sakes. We want to make sure that our votes are not devalued by having improper voting. But also, as I mentioned earlier, when you have the modest election integrity reforms that were passed by Georgia and Florida, you saw a huge increase. It is worth noting, too, that when Georgia passed these modest reforms, the President of the United States asked people to boycott the state of Georgia. Certain companies did. Major League Baseball pulled the game from there. Other major companies pulled out of Georgia. And the result was that Georgia had an improved voting system with greater participation. And I don't know if we've heard apologies from some of those companies yet.
I don't believe that we have. And another thing that I think is interesting, I believe we have some consensus here that, if we are to ban private funds to support elections officials, that there is a need to take a look at what do they need? What should these funds be spent on? What were they spending? Was it voting systems? Was it to the extent it was valid things that they need to do their jobs effectively, is there a role for the federal government in supporting that? But one thing that I think we've seen with past federal support of state and local election officials is proscriptive language about how dollars can be spent. Rather than saying, here's this money, we're going to support you, you can use it as you see fit. If you're an urban area, if you're a rural area, those needs might be different. There have been limitations and restrictions on how those HAVA dollars and federal funds can be spent. Dr. Flanders, I'll start with you. Do you have any thoughts on that? And if we were to try to engage in supporting state and local election officials, how should we do so?
Yeah, so I think there was some discussion earlier about whether this is a state issue or whether this is a federal issue, right? And I think that we always have to be cognizant of federal strings that come with any new election funding. But I think, the important thing here is when we discuss the notion of private funding, I think we need to recognize the remedy comes from more public funding, whether it comes from the federal level or the state level. It's certainly a question to debate. And obviously, I think as a conservative libertarian leaning organization, we'd probably prefer that come from the state level to the extent possible. But the important thing is let's get the private funds out, and then we can determine where the best source of state and local funds is.
And Ms. Hemingway, any comment from you on that subject?
It's just worth noting that different people vote in different ways, and that minor changes and subsidies toward one type of voting over another can actually have a dramatic partisan impact because of those differences.
All right, and then finally, because I get to go last in our committee, I'm interested, Ms. Hemingway, is there anything that we haven't asked you today that you think it is important for this committee to know as we go forward doing our work?
I don't know, but I do want to say that if people truly care about conspiracies with elections, that I hope that the people on the other side of the aisle here cared as much about the false and dangerous conspiracy theory that Donald Trump stole the election by conspiring with Russia, which was something that was embraced by powerful people throughout that party. And I hope that the people on this committee renounce that, because that caused a lot of damage and problems for our country.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. Ms. Hemingway, I want to start with you. In the fall of 2020, the Center for Tech and Civil Life gave $6.3 million collectively to the Wisconsin cities of Racine, Green Bay, Madison, Milwaukee, and Kenosha, correct?
I actually have the number slightly higher. It was, over 10 million, I think, to Wisconsin proper, and I think maybe it was that amount in the fall of 2020, but as much as $8.5 million overall.
So we'll agree that it's a lot of money. Now, these cities are supposed to spend the CTCL's grant funds on things like personal protective equipment and poll workers. Is that what it was for?
And that's particularly how it was sold to the general public.
It was for worker recruitment, drive-through recruiting, nonpartisan voter education, but that's not where all the money went. In CTCL, it was spent on other things instead. So did they give it to outside liberal groups or Democratic get-out-the-vote efforts?
They actually did.
And for absentee ballot curing initiatives.
Yes, and again, in a disproportionate fashion.
And did they hire CTCL recommended staffers?
Into county offices, yes.
And so in cities like Green Bay, Wisconsin, isn't it right that they outsource the election duties to outside private liberal groups?
Yes.
But Wisconsin law says that elections are run by clerks and other government officials, right?
Very clear, yes.
And so under CTCL's grant terms, that outsourcing wasn't allowed, right?
It should not have been.
And CTCL needed to get written permission for a city like Green Bay to do this, is that correct?
Yes, I
Did
believe so.
CTCL get permission in there or any other
I
jurisdiction?
don't believe we have evidence that they did.
I don't think there's any evidence they did. So CTCL approves these plans in writing. And we have an email from the then chief of staff to the Green Bay mayor telling CTCL that she would do whatever CTCL recommended. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what did CTCL end up recommending? Scaling up the voting process by mail?
Yes.
And even recommending election staffers?
Yep.
Staying on the topic of CTCL's recommending experienced election staffers, in Green Bay, CTCL recommended an election staffer from New York. Is that accurate?
He was, yes.
But in Northeast Wisconsin, it's a pretty big place. Why didn't CTCL have anyone in mind with experience in the state of Wisconsin? Why do you think they brought someone in from the state of New York?
I don't know, but he had access to, he asked for and received access to quite a bit of privileged information.
So CTCL recommends a New York election staffer to come to Wisconsin and Green Bay to help run the election. And what role did other CTCL staffers play? Did they manage the vote by mail process with updates on absentee ballots?
Mm-hmm.
Did they send out, return, and collect absentee ballots?
Yes.
Did they supervise the counting of ballots?
Yes. Again, in Democrat areas.
In the city of Green Bay, did they help voters cure absentee ballots?
Yes.
And at least one staffer had access to the voting machines before Election Day and was running the voting counting operation on election night, correct?
Yes.
And CTCL recommended staffers in some instances actually replaced nonpartisan election workers. Is that accurate?
Drove them out, yes.
That's absolutely insane. And so when we're talking about these private funds coming in, I think it's incredibly appropriate for us to dig in and understand what they did. And it's the reason that I think it's so essential we pass my legislation that would actually ban Zuckerbucks. It would ban these private funds from coming in, because when you see what these funds were used for, it does not instill confidence in the elections process. And so let me jump over to you, Mr. Flanders, if I can. I want to go to the 2022 Racine, Wisconsin use of their Zuckerbucks funding for the illegal voting van. How did this work in practice? Did it stop in front of specific locations? Did it have a partisan bias?
Yeah, that's right. The city determined where the locations the van would park would be, and there were 22 locations that it actually ultimately parked in throughout the August primary. And when we did an analysis looking at where those were located, they were more likely to be located in Democratic-leaning areas than Republican-leaning areas of Racine.
So they took the voting van that was labeled as a clerk's office that looks like a food truck and specifically drove it to Democratic-leaning areas of the city. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
And did they match that and equally go to Republican-leaning jurisdictions?
They did not. They were more likely to go to Democratic-leaning areas.
So
than
they
Republican
utilized the funds to drive forward a partisan agenda. And is that illegal in the state of Wisconsin?
That is illegal under state law, yes,
And
sir.
the judge ruled that it was illegal, correct?
Correct.
And now, since 2020, now let me step out a little bit bigger picture. Since 2020, 27 states have banned Zuckerbucks. Is that correct?
Yes.
But in the state of Wisconsin, Governor Evers actually vetoed the ban of Zuckerbucks not once but twice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so this could all happen again in the state of Wisconsin this election cycle. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
That's the problem. So as we're having a conversation about the challenge that we face, it's the reason we have to ban this at the federal level, and it's the reason that at the local and state level, we need to see every state follow the actions of 20 other states, including states like Pennsylvania that took the action to actually ban Zuckerbucks. I appreciate our witnesses being here. I yield to the ranking member if he would like to make closing remarks, and then I will as well.
Yeah, I just thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I do think, and I certainly not in a position or have any desire to defend Mark Zuckerberg or his wife. I think if he were watching, and I suspect he's not, but if he were watching, he'd probably be shocked. If he truly wanted to affect the outcome of elections in a partisan way, he certainly could have used his money to support Democratic candidates around the country. Maybe he did, I don't know, but I don't know why he'd invested in a not-for-profit organization that was intending to help support election officials. And I would also say, it does seem to me that some of the things that have been described or alluded to actually do violate the law, but the FEC, as Ms. Torres pointed out, unanimously, including Republican commissioners, voted that there was no violation of law. So I'm happy to talk about what philanthropic organizations can and cannot do. I do think when it comes to, if you're interested in increasing voter participation, clearly there are urban areas where voter participation has lagged way behind, and if they made the decision they thought that would increase turnout, perhaps that's the way they did it. I'd love to look at that, but I think the conversation here has been much hotter than it should have been. Let's look at what philanthropic foundations can and cannot do. Let's also add, in a bipartisan way, a lot of money to support local election officials, because they certainly deserve, they are the front lines of this democracy, and we would be well served, I think, to add additional support to their efforts. But I do think I'm somewhat amused by this, because I can't imagine there, if he was really that intent on partisanship, that there wouldn't be better ways to spend his money. But with that, Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for allowing me to add a few words at the end here. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think the reason for the heat on our side is the funds were used for the partisan advantage of Democrats. And so I think as we look at these funds, the whole goal here is to get the referees to be neutral. The reference at the start that the referees in this Sunday's Super Bowl should be neutral, that you don't want them paid by a tech billionaire in San Francisco. You don't want them paid by Taylor Swift. You want the referees to be a neutral arbitrator of the law. We want the administration of our elections to be a neutral arbitration of the law. And it's darn frustrating for the American people to see private resources coming in that has a partisan impact. And as we saw in the case of the Racine voting van, it was actually proven that those funds were used for an illegal purpose. Why? Because they were used for a partisan purpose, to drive forward a partisan advantage using private funds through the election administration. And that does not instill confidence in our elections. And my goal is to instill confidence in our elections, because I am of the belief, and I think the data supports, that when people have more confidence in their elections, they're more likely to participate, and participation in our democratic process is a good thing. And so I think what we've demonstrated is that the Zuckerbucks, and in particular private funding, harms voter confidence. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. We've seen that be the case where we've seen this signed into law in a state like Pennsylvania. We saw comments from some of our colleagues saying that maybe we should look at banning private funding. I think that is what we should do. In fact, we passed that legislation through this committee. I'd love to see my colleagues on the left support that when it comes to the floor. While my governor has vetoed the Zuckerbuck ban twice, this November, voters in Wisconsin have an opportunity to vote on an amendment to the Wisconsin Constitution to prohibit private funding of our elections. I hope voters take the opportunity to do the right thing and prohibit left-wing groups from influencing elections in Wisconsin. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before us today. Your testimony has been very helpful. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask that you respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. There being no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Question us. Okay, sounds great. Fascinating.
Showing up, personally running down the list as well, addressing any of the substance of what they said, and then leaving.